Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Gateway to Asia, Transhipments in Singapore and Hong Kong. I'm Chloe Mesh, Director of Programs at USADA, the Western U.S. Agricultural Trade Association. I wanted to go over a few housekeeping notes. Today we'll be recording the session and we'll email you the recording link from our YouTube page within the next few days. Everyone will remain muted during the presentation, but please submit questions anytime throughout the webinar. We'll address questions during our dedicated Q&A session at the end, and we'll follow by email if we don't cover any questions. Well, I am pleased to introduce Will Collis from Bryant Christie, who will be presenting on today's webinar. So whether you're shipping agricultural products, manufactured goods, or specialty exports, getting your products to Asian and global markets often means navigating complex web of shipping routes. And transshipment is at the heart of that journey. Yet many exporters, it remains one of the least understood parts of the logistics puzzle. So this session is dedicated to change that. Over the next hour, we'll build a practical foundation in how transshipment works, why hubs like Singapore and Hong Kong sit at the center of global trade, and how your routing decisions directly affect cost, speed, and market research. We'll also cover what every exporter needs to know about the compliance, rules of origin, and how shipments can show up, sometimes unexpectedly, in trade data. So let's get started, and I'll hand it to you, Will.
Thank you, Chloe. I'm excited to present on this today, and hopefully everyone can walk away with a better understanding of how transshipment works, and more specifically, the value of transshipment through Singapore and Hong Kong. So, as I mentioned, we're going to focus today on Singapore and Hong Kong, but a lot of the discussion we have today can also apply to other transshipment ports in Europe, specifically Rotterdam. Also, even if you're trying to pursue avenues into the Middle East and North Africa, many of those are also delivered via transshipment through Turkey or even the United Arab Emirates. So today, we are going to aim for a few objectives, going over the basic of transshipments, Asia's role in the global supply chains, Singapore and Hong Kong as transshipment gateways and what markets they generally serve. And then we're going to have a discussion of risks, compliance, and emerging trends, followed, like Chloe mentioned, by an overview of the question and answer questions that come up through the presentation. So initially, we're going to talk about the basics of transshipment, how it works, and why it matters for global trade. So transshipment basics. What is transshipment? So it comes down to, it's the transfer of cargo between vessels at an intermediate port before reaching the final destination. Kind of a basic definition. And it's important because 30% of global container traffic involves transshipment, according to the United Nations and port industry estimates. So how does it work? Goods are shipped to a hub port where containers are unloaded and reloaded onto vessels or planes serving different routes. One thing I would like to mention, actually, as I start off, a lot of this is going to be in the terms of sea vessels. But a lot of what we say, actually, basically everything that we say, also applies to air freight. If you're shipping highly perishable products via air freight, most of the rules here are going to apply to air freight as well as sea freight. So how does transshipment fit into shipping networks? Basically, these hubs could connect multiple trade routes and allow cargo from smaller ports to access global shipping networks and vice versa. It allows large shipping lines to also access smaller ports. And why do exporters use it? You can use hubs like Singapore and Hong Kong to improve your routing flexibility, your shipping frequency, and to access more markets. And for any of you who are already involved in export, especially on the sea side, you know that going out of the West Coast, there's basically four options. You've got the twin ports of Long Beach and LA, you've got Oakland, and then you've got Seattle, Tacoma. So really, I mean, if you combine those, it's really only 3 ports. Those ports only offer certain ports of call on certain schedules. and maybe those schedules don't work, or you're not trying to hit those specific ports of call, that's where transshipment becomes an option for you. So what are the benefits of transshipment hubs? You have access to more markets. For example, if you're putting things on a vessel coming out of Seattle, it may go to Korea, probably Busan, Tokyo, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and turn back around and come back to the West to pick up more cargo. Well, what if you're not shipping to one of those specific markets? You can use transshipment to reach other destinations. That's just ties into the network connectivity. These major ports connect large numbers of shipping services. For example, leading hubs maintain links with hundreds of global ports and dozens of liner services, enabling cargo to be distributed efficiently. You can access more frequent sailing. The major hubs have more frequent sailings and air traffic cargo. So you can leave your port in Seattle or Los Angeles or Oakland more regularly, ship to a major hub, and then move from there into the smaller markets. And then finally, it provides operational flexibility. Transshipment allows cargo to be rerouted through different vessels or services, helping carriers adjust to changing demand, port congestion, or schedule disruptions. So what is its role in a modern supply chain? So transshipment, it's important to think of the global sea network like domestic air travel. We know that big major airlines like United or American or Delta, they have hubs, right? We know that Denver and Chicago are United hubs. And from there, you would get to Denver, and then you would spoke and wheel out to your smaller destinations. Modern sea freight operates much the same, where there may be a mega hub in Singapore or Hong Kong. You would take a major vessel from the West Coast there, and then you would spoke out with to a smaller port, say in Indonesia. Additionally, this is becoming more and more a factor when you consider that there's ultra large vessels that are improving the economics of sea freight. Many ships now carry in excess of 20,000 TEUs. A TEU would be a 20-foot container equivalent, making it inefficient for them to call in many of these smaller ports. And they are focusing on, and sometimes impossible given the infrastructure at the port and the depth that these ships float at. Sometimes they can't access some of these more shallow ports. With the size of these ships, they will ship to major hubs that can handle the logistics of their vessel, and then they'll be loaded onto smaller vessels which access other ports that may be logistically impossible for the major vessels to dock at. As I mentioned before, approximately 30% of global container traffic now involves transshipment, highlighting the importance of these hub ports in global shipping networks. This number is probably going to expand given the investments we'll talk about later that countries and companies are making in these hub ports. And they improve your network cost efficiency. Transshipment allows carriers to maximize vessel utilization and reduce per container shipping costs by concentrating on cargo flows through major hubs. It's just more efficient for them to use very large vessels going from major hubs to major hubs, and then using small vessels to move from those major hubs to the smaller ports. And like I said, much of this applies to airlines as well. If you're shipping via air, they may go to 2 or 3 different places in Asia. You can offload in Hong Kong or Singapore and then transfer to alternate locations. So how does Asia play into these global supply chains, and why is it central to global manufacturing, trade flows, and logistics? Asia is home to at least 7 of the top 10 busiest container ports, depending on the list you look at. Some lists, it's as high as 9 of the 10 busiest ports, with Rotterdam in the Netherlands being among the top 10 as well. But on this list, you've got Shanghai, Singapore, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Busan, Korea, etc., making it essential to global container traffic. But also, and we'll talk about this more later, transshipment does make certain markets look more desirable than they may be when you're looking and doing market research. Because, for example, if you're looking at U.S. exports to Hong Kong or Singapore, oftentimes when that data is reported, that's listed as the destination, but it's not really the destination of the product. It goes to Hong Kong and then it moves to a different vessel. So sometimes it looks like Hong Kong and Singapore are huge markets. The same is very much true for the port of Rotterdam in Europe. It looks like the Netherlands is the largest importer in all of Europe. While that's technically true, that is not the final destination of the product, and it can be a little bit skewing when you're doing market research. And then, it results in interconnected trade flows. Agricultural products frequently move between multiple Asian economies for processing, packaging, and re-export before reaching consumers. Major trade flows shape Asian logistics. The Trans-Pacific route from Asia to the United States and back is the world's largest container trade lane, carrying roughly 30 million TEUs annually between Asia and North America. These routes move large volumes of U.S. agricultural exports to major Asian entry ports. And then there's regional redistribution. Once the cargo reaches Asia, shipments are often consolidated or redistributed through regional hubs before moving into secondary markets across Southeast Asia and China. Even further, things can move from especially Singapore over to South Asia, like Bangladesh, India, or even all the way over to the Gulf states. And this ties into, like I mentioned, the feeder vessel networks. The large container ships call at the major ports, while smaller vessels they distribute cargo to hundreds of regional ports that are not served by long-haul routes. This will be very true when we're talking about Hong Kong specifically. So how are trade disruptions reshaping global shipping? And I'm going to start off by talking about the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And you may be thinking, well, if I'm shipping from the West Coast to Asia, I'm not using the Suez Canal. Why does that affect the shipping from Seattle to Hong Kong? And the truth is, there is a roughly fixed number of sea vessels. And those vessels have a very intricate map and timeline of how they move around the globe. But in 2023, with the Red Sea attacks primarily coming out of Yemen, many vessels avoided traveling through the Suez Canal. And like I said, how does that affect Asian trade? Well, those vessels then have to go around the Cape of Good Hope, which is about 3,500 to 4,000 additional miles, adding transit days of 10 or more to the trip. To ensure that cargo continues to move efficiently, the sea lines then have to reassign vessels from the more profitable Asian North American trade to the Asian European trade because they're traveling further. So they need more regular vessels because they're not able to use the Suez Canal, which reduces the availability of vessels in the Pacific. Similarly, in late 23 and early 24, due to a drought in Central America, the Panama Canal had to reduce their vessel throughput initially by 30% and then almost by 50% because there simply was not enough water to operate the locks in the Panama Canal. If a vessel didn't have an appointment at the locks, sometimes they had to wait up to 2 weeks to get an opening to get through the Panama Canal. Those vessels then were not available to continue to load and offload throughout the global shipping cycle, reducing the availability of container space. That resulted in higher prices for containers in 2024, reflecting tighter vessel capacity and longer voyage. Additionally, it affected schedule reliability, where reliability fell to about 50 to 55% in 2024, which vessel reliability would be leaving and arriving on the day represented on the schedule. So half of vessels were either departing their port late or arriving at the port late in 2024, which disrupts networks, changes schedules, results in skipped ports of call, etc. So that's where transshipment comes in, because as I mentioned, it allows you to utilize different shipping lines, different vessels that may not be going directly to the port that you're interested in shipping to, but they allow a way for them to get the product to the port that you're shipping to on a more regular schedule. Now we're going to shift our perspective from overall transshipment to Singapore specifically and how it's a gateway to Southeast Asia. So let's start talking about the shipping trends in Singapore. Singapore is roughly, depending on the year, the second most active container port on the planet. In January of this year, that port handled 3.89 million TEUs, which is up 11% year over year. For comparison, that's roughly the same amount of container traffic that Oakland handles in a year, similar to Seattle. LA and Long Beach, if you combine them, are the largest. Well, they're each individually 1 and 2 in container shipments from the United States. In an annual basis combined, they do about 19 million TEUs. Singapore handles roughly 40 million itself. So it's an enormous shipping hub for the world. On top of that, it's the most active transshipment hub on the planet, with up to 85% of the containers running through Singapore having a destination, 85% of the containers that touch Singapore have a destination that is not Singapore. So only 15% of the containers that arrive in the port of Singapore stay within Singapore. So it's enormous in terms of transshipment. The Red Sea had a major impact. The Red Sea crisis had a major impact on Singapore because it is often a hub from Asia to Europe, which caused vessel delays in the port. It caused changes to schedules because people were going around the Cape of Good Hope, increased traffic in Singapore, and increased transshipment activity through that hub. Singapore is doubling down on its role as a major transshipment hub right now. So they are developing what they call the Tuas Megaport. It's I believe, $20 billion investment in Singapore, which will take their capacity from 35 to 40 million TEUs up to 65 million TEUs per year. That is expected to finish by 2040. I think we all know how major infrastructure programs hit timelines, but if I were to trust any government on its estimate of how long it would take to do a major infrastructure project, it would be Singapore. So they are doubling down, and I mean literally doubling down. They may double the throughput of containers through Singapore depending on the year of reference. Singapore naturally benefits from its geographic location and its geography. It sits directly on the Strait of Malacca, which is one of the world's most important maritime choke points. It's huge in terms of global traffic. Now, how much of that is container and how much of that is oil shipments? It's going to lean heavily towards oil shipments. A significant amount of the oil that goes to China and other Asian nations comes from the Middle East and travels through the strait. But that results in roughly 1/4 of all global trade running through the Strait of Malacca and bypassing directly or through Singapore. It gives you direct access to major trade routes. So if you're going from the West Coast to India, for example, you have to travel through the Straits of Malacca. It's the only way to go. So it connects you to Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia, and from the other direction to North America, which makes Singapore an ideal transshipment position. It allows vessels on major routes to effectively transfer cargo to the regional feeder networks. For those of you that aren't familiar with this map, Singapore is right here. It's an island nation off the southern tip of Malaysia. So we go. I'm going to go back real quick. right here. I had my cursor on the wrong page. This is where Singapore is located. So what are Singapore's key strengths and use cases? So it's, like I mentioned, it's a neutral and natural global trading hub. Singapore is an island nation that is, up until recently, was essentially operated under a benevolent dictator, but has very strict government controls and central planning. So it operates as a free port with minimal tariffs and streamlined customs procedures, making it attractive for redistribution and re-export. As I mentioned before, 85+% of containers handled in Singapore are transshipments, with only 15% of the cargo actually landing and being consumed in Singapore. It's also a major trade finance and services hub. Because of the governmental structure, many major financial institutions have offices or are based in Singapore, and that allows for them to facilitate trade with financing and facilitate global transactions. And in terms of common use cases for exporters, companies use Singapore as a regional distribution network with inventory staging and consolidation before shipping to Southeast Asian markets. So if you're considering shipping to Southeast Asia, primary ports that you would visit after transshipping in Singapore would be in Malaysia and Indonesia initially. It services those not amazingly, but significantly. And, Indonesia is a country of, I think, 200 million people with very limited calls from the major shipping lines. Instead, they rely on shipping to Singapore and then transshipment to Indonesia. Next, we'll take a look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong's a little bit different than Singapore, and it's changed over the last couple of decades, but it serves both as a transshipment point across Greater Asia, but also is a major transshipment point for entrance into mainland China. So it's a little bit unique in that perspective. As Singapore is completely its own island nation with no outside government effect, Hong Kong, with its relationship or its being part of Greater China, also serves as access to the broader mainland China market. So in terms of Hong Kong, a little bit of historical background. As late as the early 2000s, I think 2005, Hong Kong was actually the largest container port on the planet. That was pretty soon after it became a part of China fully. Since then, traffic through Hong Kong has declined to some extent, but that's primarily due to Chinese government investment in many of their other ports like Shanghai and Guangzhou, which have taken a lot of the containerized traffic out of Hong Kong for shipment to the United States, but it still remains a top 10 port in terms of total volume throughput. It also serves as the primary entry point to the Pearl River Delta region of China. What China calls the Greater Bay Area, which includes Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou as its three largest cities. Together, those three cities plus the other ones, which I can't tell you the name of off the top of my head, but are cities with millions and millions of people. Combined, that region has 80 million people. I was doing some research before this for a little bit of comparison in terms of geography. The Greater Bay Area is roughly 21,000 square miles, which is roughly the size of South Carolina. So if you're going to compare South Carolina with a population of 80 million people, double the size of the state of California, it's incredibly dense with an incredible number of consumers. Hong Kong serves as the primary entry point to that region of China. And that's facilitated through this hub and spoke type model, where the major sea vessels enter into Hong Kong and then shipments are loaded onto smaller river-going vessels that can then depart Hong Kong and reach these other major cities in the Delta. Beyond Greater China, Hong Kong also maintains shipping connections with over 450 ports worldwide, supporting both global routes and the regional feeder service. So how does it serve as a gateway to China? Hong Kong serves as a gateway to China in both the inbound way, as we've been talking about, as exporters from the United States, but also for products coming to the United States. And that's why the vessel traffic is so high. So it sits adjacent to major production centers of the Guangdong province. I mentioned earlier Guangzhou and Shenzhen. Shenzhen is essentially the Silicon Valley of China. It's where their largest technological companies are based, like Huawei is an example, which is the largest phone producer on the planet. Those companies will often use river vessels to ship their products to to Hong Kong, and then they're loaded onto seafaring vessels for distribution around the world. How does that affect West Coast outbound trade for U.S. agricultural products? Well, because the vessels need to go to Hong Kong to pick up products, there are very regular and often calls into Hong Kong taking product from the United States back so that they can reload with technological products coming out of the Greater Pearl Delta. So that increases the traffic through Hong Kong, then allowing transshipments to either enter mainland China or to be redirected to other markets around the region. Like I said, there's integrated sea and river logistics. So if you are interested in shipping to mainland China, Hong Kong can serve as your primary entry point, although you could also enter through other major ports such as Shanghai. And then it serves similar to Singapore. It's an international trade services hub with major companies, freight forwarders, commodity firms, financial institutions, etc., facilitating global trade. So what are the key strengths and typical use cases for Hong Kong? First thing is efficient customs clearance. Hong Kong consistently ranks among the world's best and most efficient customs environments, with average cargo clearance completed within hours as opposed to days in many other ports, which supports rapid cargo turnover. It's a high-value food trade hub. Hong Kong imported about $27 billion in food and agricultural products in 2023, creating strong demand for premium and specialty foods. Most of that food is not staying in Hong Kong. While it is a large city, $27 billion, a significant component of that is being re-exported either into mainland China or around the world. Additionally, cold chain and perishables handling is a big consideration. Hong Kong International Airport, especially for air freight products, handled 4.3 million tons of cargo in 2023. And that's especially impressive when you consider the scale of air shipments. Air shipments are significantly smaller than sea vessels. That's pretty understandable. In terms of produce, you can put over 1,000 boxes of fresh produce in a sea vessel in a 40-foot container. We're talking a couple hundred in an LD7, which is the standard size container for for air shipments. So when you get to 4.3 million tons, that's a ton of air traffic and a ton of air freight traveling through Hong Kong. And if you're willing to pay for air freight, that means that you've generally got a perishable product, and they have the ability to maintain cold chain through the transshipment process and ensure that your product reaches the customer at the highest quality possible. And as I mentioned before, it serves as a market entry platform for China, and exporters often use Hong Kong as a commercial gateway to build relationships with both regional distributors around South Asia and Southeast Asia, but also to build relationship with buyers in mainland China. Many importers in mainland China will also have an office in Hong Kong. So if you're testing out shipments into Hong Kong, they may have a relationship or another office in mainland China, which allow you to further distribute into the market if tariff rates make that a commercially viable option. So what are the risks of transshipment? How do you maintain compliance, and what are the emerging trends? We'll talk about some key regulatory considerations, market developments, etc. So number one, transshipment can affect your market research. I touched on this before, but because cargo is often routed through these logistic hubs, certain economies and countries appear to import more product than they actually consume. I talked about it multiple times, but if you were to look at export statistics to Singapore, that would be over-indexed by about 85% because most of the products are not consumed in Singapore. The same is true for Hong Kong, and as I mentioned, in the EU, the Netherlands. So what that does is it obscures the real regional demand centers. If things are going through Singapore and that's how it's listed in the export statistics, it can become very challenging from that perspective to determine where the product's actually going. Those statistics are much more challenging to tease out. And that has implications for market intelligence. Exporters often need to supplement their trade statistics with other distribution data, buyer relationships, and regional logistics insights to identify where the real demand lies, as opposed to saying, oh, Singapore's a huge market or Hong Kong's a huge market for my product. The other important thing about transshipment is compliance and rules of origin, and this is following under increased scrutiny based on the ongoing trade disruptions under the Trump administration and the challenges we're facing with many of our trading partners, China being the greatest example. So first things first, it's important to maintain certification of product origin. Under the World Trade Organization rules of origin, goods that only pass through a port without processing retain their original country of entry. This ties to the importance of documentation. Accurate bills of lading, certificates of origin, and traceability records help customs authorities confirm that goods moving through hubs like Singapore or Hong Kong remain compliant with the law. And this is something that what I would say is unscrupulous actors have been attempting to circumvent in recent trade disruptions. The example here given is from 2018 to 2020 when the U.S. and China had a tariff dispute, but essentially people would try to misrepresent where the product was manufactured or where the origin was by shipping from China to Vietnam or another country, try to represent the product as Vietnamese to avoid tariffs coming into the United States. On the other hand, this does happen with U.S. products as well, especially traveling through Hong Kong into mainland China. So one of the not so secret secrets is that there is a significant amount of, I think they call it the gray fleet. It would be, smuggling would be another word to do it, from Hong Kong into the Pearl River Delta for people trying to avoid customs and duties. Things are shipped into Hong Kong. They are then misrepresented on documentation and travel from Hong Kong into mainland China. It is important to verify who you are working with so that you do not fall under you do not get into business with people who are bending or breaking the rules in trade between Hong Kong and China to avoid tariffs and duties, because some of those penalties and challenges can come back onto the original exporter as well. So knowing who you're in business with, making sure you have proper documentation and how your product is being handled is of critical importance. What are the trends influencing these transshipment networks? So, as I mentioned, the Red Sea and Suez disruptions, along with the disruptions that were in the Panama Canal back in 2024 and 2025, have had major changes, or can have major changes on global shipping routes. One that's not as impactful right now on containerized shipments would be the ongoing challenges in the Straits of Hormuz. those vessels are distinctly different than the vessels that carry containers. Oil tankers can only be used for one product, and that's, or maybe multiple products, but they're not outfitted to handle containers. So the delays and the challenges associated with global oil trade are not necessarily affecting the vessels associated with the container trade, although the impacts on fuel pricing, of course, may be felt downstream in shipping rates because vessels will need to pay more to, or shipping lines will need to pay more to fuel their vessels. We also are seeing the rise of intra-Asian trade. Intra-Asian trade now accounts for 50 to 60% of Asia's total trade, increasing cargo movement between regional ports and logistics hubs. This just ties into the growing trend of transshipment. The other one we're seeing is regular movement from China into other Asian markets, which allows for increased transshipment opportunities. Following the 2018 to 2020 trade disruption between the United States and China, many companies, particularly in the technology space, but also in textiles and other manufacturing, invested in production facilities outside of China, such as Vietnam, Thailand, and other Southeast Asian economies, in an effort to avoid future disruptions between the United States and China, or potentially Europe and China, so that if there were additional tariffs or embargoes or things like that, they could still utilize their production facilities in second markets and avoid some of those tariffs or embargoes. However, they still maintain manufacturing plants in China, so products are often produced or parts are produced in China, and then final assembly happens in these third-party countries, but the products have to get from China to those third-party countries, allowing for additional transshipment. This also ties into supply chain diversification. Companies are spreading production and logistics across multiple Asian countries, increasing demand for flexible hub-based shipping networks. The one thing I haven't touched on here that is one more risk associated with transshipment is delays and, in the worst case scenario, misplacement or misallocation of a container. An example that I have personally seen, back in 2019, I traveled to Guangzhou, China, for the California cherry industry. And I was there in the peak of the season in late May or early June, and we went to the Guangzhou wholesale market. And there was very limited supply of California cherries in the market. And the importers related that there had been a series of storms around Hong Kong, which is not that far from Guangzhou, but essentially they'd experienced a series of storms that had delayed the river vessels departing Hong Kong that would have brought the cherries from Hong Kong to Guangzhou. That was something that couldn't be avoided by the importers, but resulted in delays because of weather challenges. The same thing can happen with air freight, especially in the late summer and fall. That region of the world experiences typhoons, major tropical storms, etc., which can cause delays or cancellations or rerouting of air freight or of airplanes, which can result in challenges with transshipping based solely on the weather. So while it is a challenge with transshipment, it's not a challenge that's unique to transshipment. Anytime you're trying to ship around the world, weather is a major consideration. But it is something to consider that there are additional opportunities for delays when you are doing transshipment. You know, we've all ordered things from Amazon that say it'll be here in 2 days, and it's not here in 2 days, and you get the email that says, we're sorry, something is delayed. The same thing can happen with containers, where a container is misplaced, or it's not loaded on the ship because somebody was sleepy, or, those types of things happen. So there are some risks related to transshipment that come along with that. But at the same time, it's an incredibly valuable resource for shippers and exporters to utilize, especially if you're not accessing these major hubs like Tokyo, Busan, Shanghai, etc. If you're looking to enter secondary markets or secondary cities, transshipment is just about the only answer. So with that, I haven't been monitoring. Are there any questions from the audience?
We had one statement, but no questions right now. There might be a few trickling in, but I'll read off the remarks. Well, this is from Bridget. They had mentioned, from my experience, it's the logistics company that decides on the actual route. In my case, the CTN of grain sold to Indonesia, the logistics co. did the booking via Singapore. So that was just one of the statements from the chat.
Yeah, that's a great point. Logistics can be handled internally or externally, depending on the size of your operation. So one thing to consider is if you're using an exporter or you're using a freight forwarder, some of these decisions aren't necessarily your final decision, or they provide you with different options or quotes. Similarly, oftentimes they will coordinate the transshipment through the other port, and they have an agent there that helps them to handle the customs clearance and the forwarding and the reconciliation or the breakdown of the container. So those are options that oftentimes we would suggest that new exporters take to the market. Oftentimes you won't see groups handle most of their own logistics until they do achieve a larger scale where those things become more cost effective to handle internally. You've developed internal expertise, etc. The other option, is logistics are handled by the buyer. So if you're selling to a major chain retailer in Asia, they'll often have contracts with the vessel lines to secure preferential shipments because they're buying from you, they're buying from someone down the road, they're buying other products from Washington, they're buying products from California. So they have a contract with the shipping lines that basically manages the logistics as well. That all comes down to commercial considerations and negotiations with your buyer, but that is a good point.
Thank you. We do have a question from Kevin. If we want to ship all products to Singapore, then send part of the pallets to Japan and then the rest of the pallets to Korea, how do we do it? Shall I apply for the respective documents before shipping the container out to Singapore?
So I will start off by saying I'm not an expert on Singapore documentation. While I do know a decent amount about Singapore, I don't know exactly how you would handle that in terms of documentation. I would suggest that you work with WSATA, and they have an in-country representative who is based in Singapore. You can get that contact information there, and they may be able to provide you with the contacts of a customs clearance agent or freight forwarder in Singapore who can walk you through the process of how that documentation should be handled. I do know that that is logistically feasible, and it can be done, but in terms of what forms and how to specifically fill things out, I wouldn't feel comfortable providing my.
Thank you, Will. Any more questions? We'll give it a minute or so just in case if someone's typing. All right, next question. Is it accurate to say that there is inherent risk in utilizing transshipment simply due to the additional handling required fundamentally versus port to port via one of the larger main trade hubs, which would also account for the value in doing so? Or is the idea more so value in leveraging these secondary hubs and transshipment to reach markets underserved by the major ports?
I think both are true. So if you're trying to ship from Seattle to Tokyo, there are generally speaking very regular vessel departures from Seattle to Tokyo. And if that's the case, I would recommend getting on a vessel that's going from Seattle to Tokyo, because if you're going Seattle, Hong Kong to Tokyo, there is additional risk in delays or etc. There is more risk from that perspective in transshipment. But, and this, I'm just throwing this out there as an example, if you're trying to go to Jakarta, there may not be nearly as regular vessel service from Seattle to Jakarta as there is to Hong Kong. If you have a perishable product, or you're trying to meet a deadline, or you're trying to meet a specific schedule from the importer's perspective, you may have to evaluate transshipment through Hong Kong or Singapore to Jakarta. So I think all of these examples have their place. Transshipment probably, at least initially, the best value is to service the secondary port cities or the secondary markets or secondary countries to some extent. If you are trying to ship to some of these major places, if you're trying to go to Shanghai, if you're trying to go to Tokyo, if you're trying to go to Korea, Busan, and you have regular vessels, then the lowest risk way is to take the regular vessel. But there sometimes are no regular vessels or very rare regular vessels because there might be an express shipment that cuts out ports. So for example, if something's going from Seattle and then it goes to Busan in Korea and then Tokyo and Hong Kong, and then the next vessel may skip Busan and it may go Tokyo, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and then you may have to wait another week. And so if those schedules don't work, sometimes transshipment is the option, but it's not the only option. So it really depends on what your demands and your needs are. Although for these secondary and tertiary markets, transshipment is usually the best option, but there is additional risk due to additional handling. All of you are most likely involved in logistics in some way, shape, or form, and it happens domestically, right? A pallet gets left off the truck. It doesn't get loaded. They unload the wrong pallet at the destination, and then the truck drives to the next locale. And they're like, well, where's my pallet? They're like, no, this is your pallet. And so that does happen in transshipment. So the lowest risk is to go, if you're going to a major port, is to take the ship that goes directly to the major port. But that's not always possible for some of these secondary markets.
Give it another minute or so. A lot of great questions. All right. Well, let's move on. And if a question pops up, we'll certainly answer it. And if you do have questions after, you can always follow up with us via email, and we'd be happy to answer those.
Yeah, and the other thing that we haven't mentioned is I'm available over the next couple of weeks to set up one-on-one consultations with you folks. It's 30-minute blocks. Alongside the link to this presentation will be, or maybe separate, I don't know how Chloe sends them out, there will be the opportunity to book time on the calendar. If you have specific questions, I'd appreciate you sending them ahead of time so we can do some background research. But if you have questions you don't want to ask here or something pops up, there is that availability for additional follow-up as well, both with WUSADA and with Blankfist. Next, Chloe, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you. So these are just some of our upcoming WUSADA events that we have that we typically do every year. The first one is the WUSADA Pavilion at Seafood Expo Global, which is next month, and that is in Barcelona. And the focus is seafood. And then our next large trade show shortly or right around the same time is FHA, which is the Food and Beverage Trade Show in Singapore. And that really covers all different industry focuses. Slide, please.
Oh, yes.
No, you're good. All right, and just following today's webinar, you will receive a survey in your My WUSADA account under the surveys tile. And so we greatly appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. And as Will had said, you can schedule a complimentary 30-minute consultation with him to discuss your specific export needs and questions. We'll make sure to include that in the follow-up email along with the recording, so you'll be able to click on the link and schedule that 30-minute consultation, as well as recap on the webinar. But we just wanted to say thank you for joining us, and especially thank you, Will, for presenting on today's webinar. And again, we will follow up via email, but we hope you all have a great day and we look forward to supporting your export journey. Thank you so much.